So let's talk about some Space Marines with some artisan crafted bolters and can now unleash a massive tirade of devastating wounds. How strong is Sternguard looking now after their recent big datasheet buff? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Sternguard veterans. And given that Space Marines in general have had an interesting time recently, and they've been buffed with a really big wound roll boost, I thought it would be a good time to revisit the unit, talk over their models and lore briefly, then go over their datasheet and combos, and how they stack up against the competition. In the Space Marine Army, the Sternguard veterans are basically their first company elite troops that prefer to fight at range rather than in glorious close combat, or it makes more sense to equip them that way for the mission at hand. With their elite status, they get the pick of the chapter's relic weapons and armory, able to access artisan crafted bolters with special issue ammunition and all manner of combi weapons. Their new kit's one of the fairly recent ones, redone for 10th edition Warhammer 40k. One of the more expensive ones as they go at £40, €51 or $62 for 5 Space Marines. Never really the best feel when it's that ratio of plastic to price. And for the amount of points that you get on the table, they're currently $1.6, which is kind of low as 40k goes. Though I guess at least a fair few people out there will have them for relative cheap at the moment, given that there was a squad in the Leviathan box set with their monopose models. They are a unit that you could convert up from standard intercessors or tactical marines if you really wanted to, with a few fancier armor plates from the bits box, maybe plus a few loincloths or something. They are a bit fancier than standard intercessors, but maybe not crazily so. I think for most games in my experience as well, people don't tend to be too bothered about the WYSIWYG of the bolt rifles versus the combi weapons, provided it's clear what the squad's supposed to be armed with from the get-go, if there is a bit of a mix of profiles like you might have from the Leviathan box. In general though, I do think they look nice enough, and the multi-part kit that Games Workshop followed up with has the choice of heavy bolter versus pyre cannon, plus a bit of fun melee gear for the sergeant, and each guy has the choice of combi versus bolt rifle. As ever, if you are looking to pick up any Warhammer models in the near future, I'll just give a shout out to the channel's affiliate discount retailers linked in the video description. They can save anywhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's normal prices. There's plenty of other great ones out there as well, but these ones listed help to support the channel a little bit if you order anything through these links, if you were going to pick something up anyway at some stage. As always, a big thank you to anyone using these. Let's get into their rules though and what they do in game. After the latest update, the Sternguard are 100 points per 5 of them or 200 per 10. That was a 10-point rise on the 90 points they were before, to reflect their boosted special rule. They've got the profile of standard size Space Marines, 2 wounds at toughness 4 with a 3+ save, and as it goes that's not really all that durable per 20-point model. Pretty much everything's going to be at least fairly efficient shooting against them, and damage to things with a little bit of AP like heavy bolters or plasma fire will be picking them up very quickly indeed for the points cost. Otherwise they're OC1, so not the biggest presence on objectives versus say standard intercessors, and for keywords they have the grenade and the tacticus keyword, so limited to the more primaris transports and things, and the grenade could allow you to toss in a few more mortal wounds on top of the load that they'll already be dealing. Their melee damage isn't really the primary focus of the unit, though it's still really not too bad given it's kind of a side benefit. You get 4 attacks per guy at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1, so that's easily enough to bully lighter horde infantry. Plus you get a power fist on the sergeant, which absolutely feels like the right choice for him, and he gets quite a big 4 attacks with that, a damage profile kind of similar to several support characters. He can take that alongside a bolt rifle as well, so it feels like a bit of a no-brainer there at the moment while it doesn't cost any additional points. It means that after they've hopefully lain waste to their primary target in shooting, they could potentially go and charge something else. Their average damage is around 7 slain termagants or around about 5 wounds to Space Marines on average, the power fist doing the most of the work there, though they do fall down a bit more against tougher stuff. Obviously it's their ranged weapons that are the more exciting bit though, and their basic small arms are really quite focused on spitting out lots of mortal wounds. Their primary weapons either give you the choice between a combi weapon or a Sternguard bolt rifle, the combi weapons being the fairly standard one, hitting on a 4+ at strength 4, AP 0, damage 1, with anti-infantry and devastating wounds, so they won't really get all that many hits, but if they do get hits against infantry there's a very good chance that'll convert directly to mortal wounds. The Sternguard bolt rifle will only get the devastating wound on the 6s, but that gets 3 shots at 12 inches and 2 shots at 24. It gets some AP at base, and the assault and heavy keywords like the intercessor pattern, so really quite a lot of advantages. I think it's kind of fun that they get the devastating wound bolt pistol as well. For a quick comparison between those two without any other buffs, in general the bolt rifle in a vacuum is a bit more of a well-rounded weapon. It's certainly way better against termagants with almost double damage, a bit better against Space Marines out of cover, and given that they're both wounding on 6s and the anti-keyword doesn't come into play, the bolt rifles do solidly better against the vehicles as well. The only targets where out of cover the combis outperform are the Terminators, so if he expects that you're going to be fighting against nothing but elite infantry, they could be worth considering, and all the numbers do skew a bit closer to the combi weapons, and the infantry targets do skew a bit closer towards the combi weapons if you get cover. The bolt rifles do have other advantages though. If static they get the +1 to hit, they can advance and shoot unlike the combis. They're far better against the 24-inch range if they have to fire out that far. And they also get on better with the Sternguard's new datasheet rule at actually making them genuinely quite good against tanks and vehicles, so I do still feel like they're the way to go. Then in addition to that, they get a ranged weapon, either a Sternguard Heavy Bolter or a Pyre Cannon. The Sternguard Heavy Bolter is basically the standard pattern but with devastating wounds. Again, that definitely makes it a lot more scary against tough stuff when you get the odd 6 and all of a sudden 2 wounds go through saves, no question asked. The Pyre Cannon's basically a boosted heavy flamer. It gets strength 6 rather than strength 5 and d6 plus 1 shots rather than d6. Out of these two, I'd say that the Heavy Bolter wins out fairly well. Again, particularly with the new datasheet rule, the Pyre Cannon's a bit better against 1 wound infantry, but I feel like you've got that pretty well handled anyway. So again, I'd be more tempted to take the option with more scope to punch up a bit. Finally though, when applied to all that shooting, we get their new special rule. This was the big boost, and it traded the previous reroll 1s to wound against the Oath of Moment target, to now getting a flat reroll all wound rolls against the Oath of Moment targets, which I'm kind of surprised that Games Workshop added in for them specifically, as it basically means that you're going to get way more devastating wounds with all those bolt rifles. It means they're basically always going to be at least fairly scary against everything, as they can just reroll everything but the devastating wounds if they're against some really high save or high toughness things, and have some at least fairly reliable high yield mortal wound firepower, which isn't usually something that Games Workshop allows too much in 40k. I feel like this rule is absolutely pivotal to their entire datasheet, and if you're not really planning to take advantage of it, then the Sternguard veterans probably aren't going to be as good a choice as other things. They were basically kind of rarely played in competitive lists at 90 points and not really seen as all that great, and now they went up to 100 points, so they're even worse unless you make use of this. So basically, if you are including Sternguard in the army list, it's generally going to be with the idea that they do make use of this rule, and at some point in the game we'll be destroying something that's the Oath of Moment targets and covering them in AP1 bolt shots and mortal wounds. It's interesting as well that those rerolls would also confer to attached characters as well, and that means that even Librarian Smites and things at range could actually be incredibly impactful, particularly against +1 to wound, and the wound rolls also work in melee as well. So that means that after all their shooting's done, if you did charge in with that Power Fist and say a fighty character attached, you could get 4 wound rerolls in melee, maybe with +1 to wound as well if you're not using a Divergent chapter. It really is a pretty massive rule, and it's one of the ones that can boost character datasheets at the same time as it boosts them. It is kind of weird that they can be both a pretty devastating shooting unit and actually a surprisingly punchy melee unit, though basically all of their good stuff is very much focused on the Oath of Moment target, and if that's needed elsewhere, then they're just not really going to do all that much compared with other things. In any case, putting the Oath of Moment buff with their devastating wounds and all their shooting, this is just the range damage output for them, and this is the average output of 5 of them against something with the +1 to wound Oath of Moments that the core codex chapters get. For this one we're assuming 12-inch bolt rifles and targets out of cover. On average it looks like you get around about 11 or 12 termagants, about 4 space marines, and around about 7 wounds to a whole bunch of hard targets, roughly the same for Terminators, Toughness 10 vehicles, and only a little bit lower for Land Raiders given that so much of the damage comes from devastating wounds. Most of the time it doesn't actually make as much sense as you might think to fish for devastating wounds unless your opponent has both a high save and you wounded them quite well already. Generally, if you're wounding quite well though, or if they're a 3+ or 2+ save in cover, then it could be worth considering and just reroll everything that isn't a 6 and try and get as many mortals as possible. In general, it does mean that if they're given the Oath buff, then they're pretty general purpose, and that's just for a squad of 5 of them. Obviously, if you have 10, then you double the numbers, and as mentioned, they could certainly follow up with a pretty punchy charge in melee as well. Just for one comparison, here's their numbers versus a squad of Hellblasters, and again these are all firing at the same Oath of Moment target, and both squads are on the move. The damage output is kind of comparable. The Sternguard do a bit better against the Termagants and the Terminators, but not by much. The Hellblasters do significantly better against Toughness 4 Space Marines, and they're both kind of similar with a +1 to wound Oath of Moment against the tough targets and vehicles. The squads definitely have some trade-offs though. The Sternguard are 30 points cheaper, don't have hazardous and have better melee. The Hellblasters can do that shooting all at longer range at 24 inches, aren't quite as dependent on Oath of Moments to actually get good, and might have a bit easier damage synergies in terms of adding a lieutenant in. It does seem on paper though that with the Oath of Moment both squads are pretty similarly efficient, and the Sternguard do have good selling points including being cheaper and better melee. Otherwise, talking about unit support, obviously it does feel that Oath of Moment is probably the single most important thing for them. though I feel like that does seem like it could be one of the main downsides. That's a really powerful ability that you can get reroll hits and +1 to wound for all manner of Space Marine units out there. By taking the Sternguard, they might be kind of hogging it from other things, or there might just be other units on the map where it just makes more sense to use it on them this turn, even if the Sternguard would be good with it, and that could be one slight disadvantage. Otherwise, for generic stratagems, they could make good use of Armour of Contempt, maybe grenades, though it might be kind of doubling down on a target that you've already got great damage buffs against. Feels like it might be better elsewhere as a result. And I guess they could Overwatch, but again, with most of their damage coming from Oath of Moment, it's probably not going to be quite as savage as certain other things using it. For characters to lead them, I feel like you could just have a good argument of just not giving them anything. They kind of self-buff with their rerolls, and if you are committing Oath to the target, there's at least a reasonable chance that you're already one-rounding your primary thing, and most of the characters don't really do all that well to actually improve their damage output. I feel like weirdly enough, if you're taking a character, it might be more of the argument that the Sternguard boost them rather than the other way around, and help them also just get massive obscene damage into the Oath of Moment targets. As mentioned, you could have a Librarian with a whole bunch of psychic attacks, also re-rolling wound rolls and maybe fishing for devastating wounds if it made sense, and they also help out the squad with a 4+ invulnerable save, making them not quite as painfully fragile. Lieutenants have a bit of anti-synergy, with lethal hits taking away from the amount of devastating wounds. Getting some extra AP-1 wounds isn't really the worst thing, but it does mean he's probably not the right choice for this unit, and captains for 80 points don't really help quite so much at range. They could give them some free stratagems if there happens to be a good one for the detachment, though I guess if you were really trying to do a 1-2 punch with them, they could trigger their +3 attacks rule, and then get +1 to wound and re-rolling all the wound rolls in Oath of Moment, maybe not so very different from Assault Intercessors, potentially spitting out a whole load of devastating wounds. I feel like a few of the named characters might offer them a little bit more though. Gilliman wouldn't be leading them, but in the same list as a Sternguard, he feels like a really good choice as an incentive to take more of them. As he'll be handing out 2 Oaths a moment per turn, it means that there's going to be more to go around, and a lot better chance that it's going to be a great idea to put one on the Sternguard's targets. Tigerius looks like it'd be a good match on paper, getting around about 7 attacks with a very general purpose profile would also like the wound rerolls, and he also adds -1 to hit, some psychic defense, free Overwatch if you want it, and also some melee stats. Azrael for the Dark Angels could also add an invulnerable save, and some sustained hits to help out their shooting, though it might be a bit of a counterintuitive thing to do with him farming his command points. He often wants to stay safe with a cheaper squad for the first few turns and then fight in the last few turns of the game. Again, those melee would certainly appreciate the reroll wounds in combat as well. Uriel Ventris could potentially deep strike them to get them into 12-inch range. I guess Lieutenant Titus will be alright for the sustained hits. It's probably a better choice for him, though he's just not that strong in general. And for the Crimson Fist, Pedro Cantor could add +1 to their shots, so getting over 40 shots out of the unit would be really quite terrifying on the turn that they strike, and he also helps improve their objective control as well, so a bit more incentive to go heavy if you happen to be playing Crimson Fists. Otherwise, for support, they do feel like one of the units that makes better use of Space Marine transports than most. Per point, they're really quite fragile, so definitely like the defense, and generally want to get within 12-inch range if they can, so the extra speed or disembark range wouldn't hurt with that. On paper, it feels like the repulsor at 180 points could be one of the best choices if you just wanted a 10-man Sternguard squad there. It's got good stats and could get them up close and then hopefully defend against charges unless it gets popped. I feel like for 5 on their own without a character, they maybe feel like they'd just be a little bit low threat for throwing it at something that you mark with Oath of Moments. But I guess with 5 of them with a character, if they're planning to move out, shoot, and then also charge, it could be tempting. The drop pod could deploy 10 of them from Deep Strike, though it's a bit expensive for what it does really. And finally, the Land Raider might not actually be as bad an idea as it sounds if you are planning on taking a character along with them, shooting and then charging into melee. If anything happens to survive their shooting phase, and hitting them with a stack of saves from those same rerolls in melee, and maybe the +1 to wound as well. For detachment things, for the most part, they feel like a unit that will just do kind of fine in most of the detachments. I feel like a fair few of the buffs and things don't really help them quite so much with what they usually want to do. Maybe the biggest exception to that might be the Librarius Conclave though. This one feels like the single strongest attachment for them, just given that they get access to this fairly silly vehicle killing enhancement. So you'd take, I guess, an 80-point Librarian overall and give it to a 10 model unit, so that's 280 points worth of Sternguard. And the enhancement gives all your ranged weapons anti-monster and anti-vehicle 5+, and then the Sternguard would be able to re-roll that against vehicles and monsters that are the Oath of Moment targets, including both the Sternguard and the Librarian's average damage output in devastating wounds. That would be 22 mortal wounds to any normal monster or vehicle unit within 12 inches, just with completely average rolling. And what's more, if you happen to pick Pyromancy this turn for your army-wide buff, you'd also get sustained hits on top of that, which would add up to a fair bit more for the regular bolters and the Librarian. Basically that means a good chance to one-shot just about any normal-sized vehicle in a game, all the way up to Titanic Knights. And just as they are, they're really quite efficient against infantry things, as their bolters do better against them. So they're probably going to have a good chance of one-shotting any other one tough tanky unit as well. Pyromancy could also add to that too, as it gives you extra AP at close range, which would make them far more effective against things that happen to wound but not dev wound with. This one seems kind of crazy, and I feel like Games Workshop might well patch this one just because they don't usually tend to like combos that allow you to do something like 20 to 30 mortal wounds from any one unit, as aside from screening a bit, there's just not really too much counterplay you can do. Otherwise, for the Codex detachments, it doesn't really feel like they have as much to offer, and Sternguard will just do what they do almost regardless of the detachment. First Company feels like it should be better for them, but they already basically have the detachment rule but baked into them every turn, and even the +1 to hit stratagem isn't exactly great on them if they're going to be targeting the Oath of Moment targets, and they're going to be hitting with most of their things anyway. For Gladius, they do like all the doctrines well enough. The Devastator one could allow them to advance and shoot the Heavy Bolter, and the Assault one could potentially have them advance, shoot and charge for a big threat range. They would have to give up Heavy Bolter fire for that. Reactive movement's nice enough for them as well, and you could use Storm of Fire for ignores cover and extra AP, though again maybe a little bit more limited on them given that they get lots of devastating wounds. Firestorm could have Strength 5 bolters and the Assault keyword, both of which are pretty good things for them. Ironstorm I guess could occasionally be useful for single rerolls if you're not shooting at Oath things. Vanguard Spearhead helps out the survivability a bit, they can back away from charges, and the +1 to hit and extra AP could be okay. Still feels better elsewhere though, and again Stormlance could allow advanced shoot and charge. Otherwise, for the Divergent chapters, I feel like they don't have, again there's all sorts of peripheral things that could help them. Blood Angel's Liberator could make them far fightier, 5 attacks each at strength 6 with their rerolls. I kind of wonder if they could even use a Sanguinary Priest for extra AP, maybe in that new detachment with the reroll 1s to hit and wound, but probably not quite worth it on balance for the big investment. Black Templars and Space Wolves both make them a bit tankier with a 6+ Feel No Pain if they choose that one at base. Their AP stratagems could also be nice enough if they do follow up with a charge with Oath rerolls. As mentioned for Dark Angels, they could be a pretty reasonable bodyguard for Azrael, even if he does have quite a lot of good choices. The Unforgiven Task Force has a few shooting things, and Inner Circle has +1 to wound. And finally in Deathwatch they have a lot of competition from their Primaris kill teams that might have a similar kind of role. They might enjoy the Tome of Ectoclades from the Black Spear though, given that that's 2 Oath of Moment targets, which is their most important thing. Overall, I do feel like the big rerolls have done enough to transform them from being a unit that very rarely appeared in competitive lists to one that genuinely has some good interest. As mentioned before though, if you're not using them to target Oath of Moment targets, they're probably not going to be as good as something else. It probably means that there's going to be lists that are better or worse for them, because if there's other Space Marine units that really need the Oath of Moment boosts and the Sternguard can't get it because of that, you might be more tempted by something that's just a fair bit more general purpose. They're fairly slow moving when they're on the board, and they've got kind of weak defense, so it basically means that they need to be kept safe, and then just go hell for leather for the Oath targets, move up, shoot it with a whole bunch of devastating wounds, and then really quite seriously consider going on to charge it as well, and doubly so if there's a character attached to make use of all those rerolls. I'd probably be more tempted by a unit of 10 of them rather than a unit of 5 for that role. If you wanted to focus on their shooting damage, you could maybe think about Uriel Ventress or a Repulsor. If you wanted to try and use them as a more general purpose, shoot and then also charge, then maybe add a character into the mix and have the plan B to jump out, shoot and then also charge. It still feels like the Librarius combo would be the single biggest auto-include, and they feel like they're better with Gilliman around, but feels like they could slot into any list well enough and mark a target with Oath of Moment, and then send the Sternguard out to shoot and charge it. It does feel like Space Marines have got a whole ton of competitors though. In terms of direct damage, the Hellblasters have got a fairly similar-ish damage profile versus Oath targets and a much longer range, and they're not quite as dependent on Oath, particularly for targeting elite infantry that they're good against anyway. There's all sorts of sturdy gun tanks that could do a fair bit of range shooting, plenty of other units for melee damage dealing. There's also like Oath of Moment themselves, and for more of a skirmish type role if you don't want to be able to threaten tanks quite so much. Standard Intercessors are also looking better than ever, with their doubled up bolter shots that will just absolutely pulverise hordes, plus their objective abilities. My guess is that due to them being a bit fragile and quite a big investment, they probably won't be auto-include, though I feel like the sheer amount of damage that they can do is going to make them interesting enough that most lists could easily justify a unit if they wanted to. In any case, let me know what you make of new Sternguard with all those scary rerolls though. Look forward to hearing what your thoughts are down in the comments, and would you be tempted to include any in a Space Marine army list? As mentioned, feel free to check out the channel's discount retailers linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support the channel. They don't cost anything extra to use and can be a good way to support on things that you are planning to buy anyway. In any case though, I'll leave that there for this one. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming a bit more directly. Channel patrons do get a few advantages: seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.